All right. So, those of you who were here on time, thank you. Sorry we're starting late here, but that's sort of how IGX goes. So, today we're going to talk about 15th century dueling as described by Paride Del Puzzo. We'll also talk about who that guy is and a lot of other details around that. For those of you who don't know me, haven't met me, my name is Michael Chidester. I run a website called Wichtenauer, which hopefully you do know and use. And I've been fencing for about 18 years now and doing Wichtenauer for about 10. Our anniversary actually is in 2 months. So let's jump right into it. Talk about what is a duel. I know that a lot of people have ideas in their heads about what a duel means, but let's look at some examples of what Puzzo means when he talks about duels. Here's chapter 1 of his section on actual duels that occurred and how they were decided. If a pact and duel accord were made to break 10 lances, and one of the two fell to the ground in an encounter before the 10 were finished, should the battle be over without waiting to break all 10 lances? This would be a duel in which the loser would be taken prisoner by the winner and ransomed back to his family. And Puzzo's answer to this is no. The duel is not over even if he gets unhorsed, because in combat, not falling off your horse does not automatically kill you. And also, in 10 passes, the other guy has plenty of chances to fall off his horse. So, unhorsing before the 10 were finished is not good enough to end the duel. All 10 have to be ridden. Chapter 2. If at the same time one wounded the other and the other the one, from which both wounds both died, which of them should be the victor? Alright, pretty different situation now. Two people are fighting in armor, probably knights. One of them gets on the other person's back. He has a lot more details than this is the chapter title. But in the chapter he goes into detail about how one of them sits on the other's chest and tells him to yield or die. And the other person says, "You yield," and stabs him in the throat. The person on the ground underneath had already been dealt a mortal wound, so he got up, staggered a few paces, and died. And they were both dead. The question is, in this context, who wins? Because you can't have a duel with no winner, especially if it's a lethal duel or a judicial duel. And the answer Puzzo gives is that it's always the challenger's responsibility to prove his case. So if he dies, he hasn't proven his case. The defendant has no responsibility other than to meet in the duel. So if the defendant dies and kills the winner, then he is the victor. Chapter 3. If two knights were challenged to fight on horseback, and one of them dismounted and killed his enemy on foot, should he justly be the victor? In this case, Puzzo says, well, it depends. Because if this were a non-lethal duel, and we'll get into what that means, then if the rule said it's a mounted duel only, then dismounting breaks the rule, and you lose. However, if it's a lethal duel, then there really aren't that many rules that are completely binding. So dismounting is totally legitimate, and the person who dismounted wins. So in this case, it depends on what the terms were set before the duel begins. And we'll get into more of these stories as we go through. This section is actually 39 chapters long, and each one has one or more of these accounts of duels. And they're all pretty interesting because of how weird they get. So, what are we talking about today? This is a dueling treatise written by a guy named Paride Del Puzzo, who's also called Parides Del Puzzo or Parides Del Puzzo in Latin. He was born in Piemonte in 1410, studied law at universities all over Italy, starting in Napoli, which is near Piemonte. It's the opposite side of Vesuvio, but it's pretty close, like a 30-minute drive today. Advisor to Alfonso V of Aragon, who was king of Napoli. At this time, Naples was a possession of Spain and not of any Italian power. He served as general auditor and general inquisitor to Alfonso V, and he died ultimately in 1493. So he was a very distinguished lawyer and legal professor at the University of Naples, and also had a lot of government functions surrounding the law courts. In the 1470s, he wrote his second legal treatise. The first one was about what we would call forensic science, and it was a very early and important work in that field. about rules of evidence and so on. The second one was called De Duelo, which is a word that he kind of made up. It was not common. He's the person who popularized the word duel in Italian legal treatises and ultimately across most European languages. It comes from the Latin word that basically just means double or paired. So duel by itself didn't mean much, and he often has to clarify that what he actually means is singolare certamine, which is single combat, or other places he says battaglia di due, a battle of two. This idea of dueling was still sort of being understood and created in this time period. But this book was republished about 1 million times. It was enormously popular. It was first published in 1471 in Latin. He translated to Italian and published in 1476 or 7. It was also later translated to Spanish and English and reprinted many, many times in the 15th century. Achille Marozzo also pirated it for his book, and it forms the 5th section of his book about dueling. This became the most influential work on dueling for about 100 years. And most subsequent dueling treatises, which is a genre that he basically invented, are responses to his book. Whether they agree with him or disagree. Pedro Monte wrote a response to this in 1509, who also is known for his fencing manual. He wrote a book that was just as long, that was all about how dueling is supposed to work, where he basically disagreed strenuously with literally everything that Puzzo says, because he's completely wrong. By about 1550, finally his influence fades, and you see a new sea change in the way dueling works. And I'll talk about that at the end. So what is he writing about? Let's talk about what it's not first. It is not this. How many of you have seen pictures like this? Hopefully all of you. This is a common motif in early 15th century fencing manuals. This sort of trial by combat with giant long shields and usually a mace or a sword. They're usually wearing these weird leather catsuits with a hood, but with bare hands and bare feet. This is based on a trial by combat rite that dates back to the Middle Ages, and by this time was more or less abandoned. Trial by combat to these people in the 15th century was not dueling. So when they talk about dueling, this was not any part of their conception. The fact that there were two different ways in which people were fighting in pairs and killing each other legally was not really an issue that they seemed to think about very much, because they had nothing in common. We're also not talking about this, therefore. Who here has seen the classic women with a flail versus man in a hole game? Yeah, right? This picture gets spread around a lot, or pictures like this. This one, unlike the fight with long shields, probably never happened at all. Ariella Alema published a paper recently where she argues that what actually happened was in Bern in 1288, there's a record of a duel between a man and a woman in which no details are given beyond the fact that the woman won, and that captured the imagination of medieval writers to such an extent that it became a pretty widespread meme. This idea that a woman can fight a man in a duel and win. This is a picture from the 15th century of what they thought it looked like. We don't actually have any details. This is a telephone game for a long time. There's also a folk tale in which a woman fights a giant who is standing in a pit up to his waist to make it even, so he's the same size as the woman. And from there, it seems likely that it started being written into legal texts, because the way common law works is when you have an idea that something happened that was legal, you write it down and it becomes influential for future cases. So it goes from something that happened 100 years previously into folk stories and then into legal codes without ever actually happening. Maybe. It could be that we find an actual case of it, but people have been looking for quite a while now and found nothing. A few times where it was threatened in the 15th century when it was well established as in this sort of lore, but never actually being fought, besides this one time. What we're talking about then is this battle of two between knights or soldiers, because according to Puzzo and other writers in the 15th century, there's not a lot of difference between a common man-at-arms and a soldier. They have this idea that he expresses as arms grant nobility. So any soldier who's fought sufficiently, and to him that means 5 years of service on campaign, is made equal to a knight in terms of his ability to function in that role and in that class of society. So he's not his social equal, but in his ability to execute warfare, they become equal. And a knight can challenge, or a commoner with 5 years of service can then challenge a knight, and the knight has to respond. Although there's all kinds of protocol that I'm not even going to get into because it's kind of tedious and really complicated. But it mostly, like there's a whole chapter of his book where he goes into, or a whole section where the chapter's like, what happens if an emperor challenges an emperor? What happens if a king challenges an emperor? Does he have to fight, or can he use a champion? And it goes all the way down to like what happens if a farmer challenges, but like every possible combination of tiers of society. Because if someone beneath you challenges you, if you have to respond, you can still appoint a champion, except in cases where the law says you can't. So Puzzo is kind of funny because in his justification for why dueling is legitimate, in his Latin and Italian books, he actually does not give remotely similar justifications. That chapter is not a translation. He rewrote it because his Latin audience was lawyers. And so what he talks about is the history of single combat across different legal codes. And he'll tell you, you know, in ancient Frankish law, they had trial by combat. In ancient Lombard law, they had trial by combat. And Charlemagne indicated that Lombardian law was part of imperial law. Therefore, imperial law recognizes trial by combat. And he gives this big, long legalist explanation. Whereas in Italian, none of that. He says, if you look at the Bible, we have the story of David and Goliath. And this story is the iconic duel that knights fight, right? David and Goliath went out there and fought single combat, and the Lord blessed David and granted him victory. And that's how all duels should work. And then he also goes from there into a bunch of classical allusions to when champions were fighting, and the Trojan War and so on. I think Amazons are raised. This is all very much about popular history now, and not about what's actually legal, because he knows that knights and princes who speak Italian, not Latin, don't actually care about that. But they are interested in a good moralistic justification based on scripture and so forth. So, next question. Reasons to duel. Puzzo doesn't tell you why dueling is justified. I've been through his entire book and it never comes up. Which means either it's not something that he thought was necessary to cover, or it's hidden somewhere really obscure and I just haven't found it yet. So I had to go to other legal texts, other dueling texts. In the 14th century, a dude named Legnano, who's from northern Italy, says there's 3 reasons to fight a duel. And Puzzo draws a lot of stuff from Legnano, so I feel okay with this. He says the 3 reasons are hatred, glory, and compurgation. Great word, right? Hatred, he says, is the worst reason to fight a duel. You should never challenge another person purely because of hatred. It's sinful, blah, blah, blah. Glory is also not a great reason, but glory at least is a virtue. So if you're seeking glory, it's not a base instinct. You're at least aspiring to something. It may not sound like a virtue in the 21st century, but in the culture of chivalry, it was sort of this weird cult of glory. And glory and martial valor were what they all aspired to. So glory is an okay reason to kill a person. However, the completely justified reason is compurgation, and that comes from the root the root that we get purged from, which means if someone accuses you, you can fight a duel to purge yourself of the accusation. And that's the reason why you're most justified. And that means it's not actually your fault. You didn't initiate it, but you were forced to fight and clear your name. What are you clearing yourself of? Talhofer gives us 7 reasons why a duel is justified, or 7 accusations. Murder, treason, heresy, disloyalty, betrayal in combat, falsehood, and rape. And this is actually very close in time to Puzzo. This is 1459. Sorry, did I step on you? And these would be reasons why you would fight a duel to the death, to actually purge yourself of these accusations, or to enforce the accusations against someone else. Whereas fighting for glory would typically be when you're not actually trying to kill the other guy, but merely defeat him so you can capture him, take his clothes, and so on. You know, proper dueling. Get paid a big ransom by his family. The challenge in the 16th century and onward is usually done by a cartel of defiance, which is the letter you send out. But to Puzzo, it has to be done in person typically by an officer of arms, trumpeter, or drummer, and you send a gauntlet as your sign of challenge. And he has this long quote explaining why, which he calls it the bloody gauntlet of battle, which is great. Or other armament, but usually gauntlet because it's the most worthy defensive piece of armor because it defends the right hand. And without your glove, you can't actually fence safely, right? We all get that, right? And then because finding his hand naked and stripped with the gauntlet that is its armor, one cannot work securely in combat without fear of incurring detriment and damage. So if you send somebody your only gauntlet, that means you're fucking serious. Or that's what Puzzo says anyways. So it has to be a glove, except also it might not be. Now, once you issue a challenge, you get to decide literally nothing else. The person who is challenged, the defendant, makes all the decisions. With the idea being that the challenger chose for the duel to happen, therefore the defendant is blameless, and the defendant can try and stack the cards in his favor. The defendant chooses weapons, and this again would be a battle for glory. The defendant can choose whatever weapons he wants and whatever armor he wants. And the challenger is required to follow that choice. In a duel to death, though, Puzzo says all weapons of war are licit, and there's no restrictions on what weapons you can use. If you're actually defending your life, then this becomes like a pitched battle where you're trying to kill the enemy. And there's nothing that's off limits in that case. This is not a fencing manual. This is just a cool picture of guys killing each other on horses. That guy may have been stabbed through the guts and dying a slow death, but he's going to murder the other guy before he goes. The defendant also chooses the field, which means he finds a prince who's willing to sponsor the duel, and this is how it becomes legal, because a prince can declare that the duel is legitimate and that no one's going to get charged with murder because of it. So you have to have a prince who's going to sponsor the duel and provide you with a field. This is what Talhofer has as his field, this tiny little ring with dogs fighting in it. Fields were often more like this, which is a much bigger arena. This is from a tournament book from the 1460s. But there's often described as having wooden barricades and actual grandstands and so on. These were very public occasions. And you could argue that part of the reason why they existed was to entertain people. But also, the prince is there in the middle and he wants to have a good view because he is still in control of how the duel happens. Yes?
I said small translation error. Of un jeu précédé by d'enjeu sur T apostrophe.
Okay. But yeah, Danjou wrote a tournament book in the 1460s in French, which was trying to describe German tournaments for a French audience. And I may have gotten the name wrong, although I feel like I've seen it written that way more than the spelling you indicates. Okay.
There's a voyelle at the beginning of the
yeah. Word. I understand. All right.
It's like saying off instead of off again.
Right. If you can't find a prince, then you can't technically fight a legal duel. And this is where the practice that Puzzo calls going to the woods, right, a la machia, comes up. And I quote him here because it's kind of a cool description he gives, right? Some say that necessity makes many things lawful which otherwise were unlawful. And for that the sword is judge and manifest witness, that he who escapes without hurt should be victorious, and that he who is slain or grievously hurt is undoubtedly defeated. And in this way a sentence of victory may be reported without a judge, because the wounds do witness in place of the judge. So this is how he describes this practice of going to the woods. And I like this also because the idea of the wounds witness in place of the judge reminds me of what Fiore says, that he fought 5 times against hostile masters and came away without wounds, which makes you wonder if he's actually quoting something here, and there was a cultural idea of wounds bearing witness. So Fiore doesn't tell us that he killed people or what happened at all. All he tells us is that he went away to fight and came back with no wounds. Draw what conclusions you will, which lines up with this pretty nicely. Puzzo says this is definitely a bad idea always and never justified because it's unknightly, and this sort of violates all the reasons why dueling is legitimate. If you just ignore the protocol and a bunch of your friends go off to the woods and someone kills someone else, and there's no witnesses. But the fact that he condemns it in a whole chapter about it means that it totally happened, enough that it was worth condemning. And this is sort of a way we can read between the lines and try to see what the dueling culture is behind his dueling ideals. How long do you have? The defendant decides when the duel will happen, although the prince really decides, but the defendant will find a prince who's going to play on his side. Puzzo says that after 6 months, it's no longer honorable to wait. So you have up to that long to actually fight the duel. Talhofer only gives 6 weeks, so 6 months is a pretty generous allotment. He says that in that time you should awaken your sleeping strength, which is a funny way of putting it, and basically make sure you're ready to defend your life. And this is just a picture of people who are doing exercises from a random manuscript. But you have 6 months to do all these things and try to get into good fighting shape if you're not actually a soldier, but you got challenged anyways. The other advantage the defendants have is what he calls making your opponent equal to you, which means any weakness or disability the defendant has, he can impose on the challenger. But the challenger has no right to get at the defendant. So if you challenge someone who's missing a leg or missing an arm or missing an eye, he calls out those 3 things, and the challenger has to have his eye covered up or his arm tied or his leg tied so that they're fighting on equal terms. He also is careful to note that being left-handed is not a disability. So you can't force your opponent to be the same handed as you if they aren't. Because the left hand is the right hand of a left-handed person, is how he justifies it. Which, that sort of makes sense. But this is a fun little tiny marginal figure that I found of a one-legged knight who's still going to fuck you up. Look at him, he's determined. This sort of tilting of scales also extends to who strikes first, which is a question that I was very interested in because this has very clear fencing implications in the fight. And this is interesting because Legnano in 1360 equivocates. He says, well, some legal authorities will tell you that the challenger always strikes first, because just as he initiates the challenge, he must initiate the duel. Others will say that merely issuing the challenge has begun it, and the defendant must respond to the challenge by striking first. But he sort of says, maybe it's just best to let the fighters figure out themselves and not make any rules about that. But Puzzo is very clear. It's always the challenger's responsibility to throw the first strike, period. So this gives me ideas about why we have so many fencing manuals that focus all their time on what happens if your opponent attacks you, and very little time on how you should walk up to someone and attack him. Because if you're not the kind of person who makes challenges very often, then most duels you might ever fight are going to put you in the defender's role, and neither of you can do anything until your opponent has attacked you. Just a thought. It also gives me ideas about why you see weird shit like this, which is a case where a guy is throwing his pommel at his opponent. Because if you're required legally to begin the fight by attacking the other guy, and you really don't want to do that, then you could find a way to technically throw an attack while staying at a safe distance and not having to actually engage. You can also throw your spear and keep your sword, throw your whole sword Fiore style and keep your spear. There's a lot of options where you can throw an attack without actually having to get engaged with your opponent right away. Especially when you're in this context where you have many weapons. It also gives me ideas about why there are records of these duels that last from noon till sundown and nobody actually gets injured. I mean, if that one guy really doesn't want to engage, he could circle around his opponent for hours without actually having any action. Although in that case, usually the answer is, well, send him home, bring him back the next day and start over because someone has to die. The other interesting sort of side note we'll get to right now is women in dueling. This is a picture of 2 Amazons? 1 Amazon?
At least 1 Amazon.
Well, at least 1 Amazon fighting on horseback that Kendra found as part of her Women in Armor research. Puzzo says that yes, noble women have standing to issue challenges for dueling, but they don't have standing to fight the duel themselves. Women must always choose a champion to fight for them. And the reason he gives is predictably misogynistic. He says, women can't fight duels because if she challenges a knight and a knight kills her, then he'll be that guy who killed a woman. But if he loses, he'll be that guy who lost to a woman. And either way, it's not fair to the knight who gets challenged. So, you have to choose a champion, a man who can fight the duel for you. It's only fair. Yeah, 15th century, right? So, I'm just going to move this. I keep stepping on it. The other what about would be the big one for me. What about Blossfechten? I got into looking at this because I was looking for evidence of unarmored longsword fighting historically, trying to answer the question of what the hell happened with all these fighting systems we have. And Puzzo is crystal clear that never, ever, ever, ever should you fight a duel without armor. And in fact, he gives 3 different stories about people who tried to fight duels without armor, and all 3 of them they were stopped before they could fight. Which he says is only correct because a duel is a battle, and a duel follows the laws of war, and there were no battles that look like this, right? You don't go off to fight a battle with no armor on, so you shouldn't go to fight a duel with no armor either. And that's his whole rationalization. However, if we again go back to the idea of going to the woods that he also condemns, that could be the place where you might actually fight a duel unarmored, but we're going to have to do more research to actually establish whether that's true or not. But Puzzo in no wise gives permission for any kind of unarmored dueling. He says you have to at least put on some quantity of armor for it to be legitimate. This is no better than what pimps do, or butchers. I believe he says pimp in Latin and butcher in Italian, right? It's for fleshmongers. You're just going out there naked touching each other. It's just, it's completely dishonorable, unchivalrous, and so on and so forth. Put some damn armor on. So I can't help there. I even have the quote here. 2 knights who fled for battle, obtained a field. They deliberated to fight unarmored, except for swords and without any body armor. And they said, no, it's okay, because we'll put ourselves in a state so we have the semblance of a raving dragon. And we'll defend ourselves, and it'll be awesome. And yeah, the prince said no in this case. A different case, the judge said no. A different case, the commander said no. It's never ever okay. That's his bottom line. So my search for actual historical Blossfechten continues. More suitable for vile butchers than valorous knights. And for this, the prince was highly praised. Okay, let's go back to dueling stories. What happens if 2 fighters have agreed that whoever gets unhorsed first on horseback will be the loser, and in the first pass they both fell off their horses? This is another case where the challenger has to defeat the defendant. The defendant doesn't actually have to defeat the challenger. So because the challenger fell off his horse, then the defendant wins. What happens if the defendant dismounts and attacks the other guy's horse, causing the horse to fall on the other rider and kill him? Well, if this was a lethal duel, then all's fair in love and war, and there's no rules. So kill the horse, kill whatever. If you can't attack the guy, I believe in this case he mentioned the other guy's armor was too formidable, then sure, why not kill his horse? Also, check out this guy's crazy swan hat. That puts the Fiore swan hat to shame, really.
You stole me to do it.
Somewhere WMAW had a swan hat, actually. It was epic. What about, so there's questions about disarming and wounding. And by disarming, what he means is mostly stripping off your opponent's armor. And he gives the test case of, okay, so both people are riding at each other, and one person knocks off the other person's gauntlet and spalder. The other guy takes the first guy's shield. Who wins that exchange? And so he gives this whole hierarchy of pieces of armor and weapons, where weapon is the top, followed by shield, followed by helmet, followed by glove, even though glove was before said to be the most important one. He changed his mind here. Whereas a spalder is nothing and doesn't even count, because I mean, whoever loses the battle because they lost their spalder, right? But he also has the same question a few chapters on of what wound has priority. He goes into like what happens if someone gets stabbed in the eye, and the person gets their nose cut off, or one person gets hit in the arm, one person gets hit in the leg, and so on. And he has to give a whole hierarchy of wounds and which one is most important if no one dies, of which he has an interesting distinction where the eye is the best target, but wounding your opponent's face is totally not cool because the face is the seat of honor or something. So you're attacking your opponent's honor unjustly. So you can't actually bloody their face, but somehow if you can take the eye out without breaking that rule, then you have the best case scenario. And the arm is worth more than the leg, obviously. But in an interesting twist, he goes into a duel where a lefty fought a righty, and they both got injured in the right hand, and the lefty demanded that he should win because he only had his offhand injured, whereas the right-handed guy had his main hand. And Puzzo says, no dice, because fighting requires both hands no matter whether you're right-handed or left-handed. So both hands are rated equally. It's kind of funny though, because Puzzo tends to not always have be entirely clear about how these things break down. So he tells us that the sword is the most important thing you can take from your opponent, and is the worth the most armor. But then later on he gives a story of a person who had his sword taken away and continued to fight for hours until sunset with no further action done. And takes on the question of whether the guy who was disarmed loses. And the answer should be clear, right? Sword is the most important armor you can take away. But in this case he says it's so cool that a guy managed to fight all day with no sword and defend himself against a guy with a sword that really he's clearly the more valorous and has more martial spirit. So he should be the victor. Right? If you can pull that off, then you've demonstrated that you have the most martial spirit ever. So he kind of fanboys out there. And there's a few places like that where he kind of has to acknowledge that, you know, in this case, coolness wins, and the rules maybe don't really matter. Wounding the hand, I actually just covered a minute ago. Forgot I had a slide for this. When a lefty fights a righty and both are wounded in the hands, which will be the more honorable, victor or loser or equal? And the answer is both hands are worth the same. But what about ninjas? Everybody's seen this picture, I hope, which is one of Fiore's weirdest things he does. But Puzzo says, 2 knights challenged to mortal combat with iron-shod maces entered the list. One brought a hollowed mace in which cavity carried full of a pestiferous powder, which, sending it about the visor of his enemy, suddenly deprived him of the sight of his eyes, in a manner that he was forced to cover them. And with this malign stratagem, he became victor, having deprived his enemy of sight and sense. Puzzo goes on for like 3 pages about this, because he's really torn about what the right answer is here, in ways that maybe don't quite make sense. And he has to consult, like he goes through every mythological precedent he can find. He talks about Amazons and Trojans. He goes through Lombard law and the rules, prohibitions against bringing any kind of dust or powder onto the field, which in Lombard law was about magical charms. But he's trying to cross-apply it to this poison powder. And in the end, he's like, well, you can argue that this is not a way that properly shows off your martial spirit. He even says that if this were a court case, then you couldn't win over a jury by throwing blinding powder in their faces. So should we allow this in a duel? Like, he really isn't sure where to go with this. But in the end, he says it's probably not legitimate, but maybe other legal authorities should weigh in on this because it's a difficult case. He has some odd hang-ups sometimes about what is and is not valid. We would say this is not actually fighting at this point, and this is blindness powder, so maybe it's not allowed, but he can't get there. It is, however, an interesting case where one of the most bizarre things in a fencing manual comes up in an unrelated source. So there's that. Okay, but what if 2 combatants, one having wounded the other gravely, covered his eyes upon seeing the blood, And the wounded one arose and took his enemy and tied his hands and feet, and after a short space of time, died of his wound. So if you have a problem with blood, maybe you shouldn't be a duelist, is the first lesson here. But, in this case, the guy who died, his family demanded that his opponent be given to them as his prize of combat, that he be declared the victor, and they take the guy prisoner. Like, clearly, he took him prisoner. He tied the guy up. But, Posla says, in this case, because it was a duel to the death, there is no taking prisoner. And the fact that he tied the guy up didn't really matter, because the only way to win this fight was to kill your opponent. So because the guy who fainted and got tied up managed to actually deal a death wound, he's still the victor. However, in any other situation, then he would be legitimately a prisoner. So again, we go back to glory versus accusations and compurgation, right? In a duel for glory, you might still die. That was totally allowed to kill the other person, although you shouldn't be doing it maliciously or necessarily like go out there and try to murder him. But if you accidentally murder him, that's still okay. No form of dueling was actually safe. We should always keep that in mind. Even tournaments were not safe. If you look at records of tournaments in the 14th, 15th century, you'll find 4 guys died in this 100-person tournament, and they just kind of shrug and move on. There was one, I found a reference that was between English and Scots along the border skirmishes, and they found time for a little tournament in the middle of battles, and it notes that they each got the opportunity to kill some of the other people in the tournament. So, in some cases, that was what you wanted to have happen, even in sport. Especially if you're English and Scots. Last thing we're going to cover here is duels that actually aren't 2 people anymore, but is still dueling to him. We have 4-on-4 and 7-on-7 get described in Pozzo. And in this case, he's not really clear on why this happens, just that it definitely does, and is a thing you should know about. But it's still a duel because there's still one challenger and one defendant, and then a bunch of their guys. So in that case, it doesn't matter what happens to anybody except for the 2 principals. So if you bring 6 of your guys and he brings 6 of his guys, and you fight a giant melee duel, even if all of your guys die, if you kill the guy you challenged or who challenged you, you win. So the rest of these guys are just kind of schmucks who are expendable. Right? We can imagine that this were like some kind of high status person and his retainers. He doesn't really care about them that much, but it's part of it. So they're there to defend him and to try and kill the one other guy, and the other team is working the same way. So in that sense, even 7-on-7 is still a battle of two with a bunch of extra little moving parts involved. Yes?
How does he hold if one of my retainers kills the guy?
Oh, that's fine. All that matters is the guy dies. Right, that's why you bring extra guys. To keep you safe and to try and execute the goal of the exchange. Or, if it's a different kind of thing, like if you're unhorsing the guy or whatever the win condition is, only the one guy on the other side matters. Because he asks questions like, what if in a battle of 7-on-7, 5 guys get unhorsed on one side and 3 guys die on the other side, who wins? And he has a bunch of those questions, because apparently this was common for a while. And it always comes down to what happened to the challenger and what happened to the defender. Nobody else matters. All right, so that's about what I have to say today. This is still ongoing research. And in fact, about a month ago, I discovered a much bigger subject this ties into that I still have to study, because I finally, in the week before Sword Squatch, found the actual history behind this whole dueling practice that he describes. And some version of it goes back to the 14th century and has its origin in the 100 Years' War and has spread all over Europe by the end of the 14th century. But purely in a military context, it wasn't people living in cities who were doing this. It was only the mercenary and knightly armies that were moving around and fighting wars. And it only spreads into cities in the late 15th century. So prior to that, if you weren't a man-at-arms of some kind, then you never got exposed to this battle of 2. And I still have tons and tons of research to do on what that means for all of this. But as far as Pozzo is concerned, I hope I've given you guys a bit of a primer on what we're talking about. And to me, this opens all kinds of lessons about what the subject that our fencing manuals are considering might consist of, which is not any particular murder sport or anything like that. In a lot of cases, it might be this sort of semi-safe fighting for glory or fighting for, you know, inside of camp, fighting with people you don't like, in a place where you might not die. You might just be taken prisoner, have to pay a bunch of money. You might just lose your arm on your horse. But there's a lot of shades of fighting that fall short of actually trying to kill and be killed. So, what are your questions on this? Yes?
Do we have any idea how common this was? Late 14th, 15th, early 16th?
It depends on what we mean by common. So, it's something that everyone seems to know about, and it appears in basically every chronicle. But whether that means it happens once a year or once a month, or like how often it's happening all over Europe, I can't say right now. I mean, the reason why Pozzo wrote his book is he thought it was a useful enough thing that it needed to be pulled out of military law and put into civil law. So he wanted to bring dueling into cities in Italy and make it a normal activity that common people could engage in. Whatever that means for how common it was. Among soldiers, I mean, soldiers get into fights a lot. And the reason why this arose was because it gave commanders a tool to sort of keep the violence very focused. Like, if you want to fight this guy, all right, we're going to do it right. None of this fighting in the tents. We're gonna actually have a day, and we're going to have a time, and you're going to fight while everyone watches. So it was a way of trying to control violence. And a lot of these people were very violent people. So we can imagine that they were doing it as often as they wanted to, but actual numbers I can't say yet. There's a whole lot of chronicles I need to go through. I've found maybe a few dozen cases so far over 200 years, and there's a lot more still to find, I'm sure. And there's also a question of what kind of territory this was happening in. France and Italy, definitely. Was it happening in Germany? Probably, but I need to do more research. Was it happening in Eastern Europe? I have no idea. So some of those questions are still outstanding as well. Who else had a question? Steve.
So, it seems like a lot of what you were talking about was kind of just like edge cases, like going off the beat, well, like this situation, that situation.
Yeah.
Like, so the answer to all of them for if it's a duel to death seems to be like, doesn't matter, you have to kill him.
In a lot of cases, he even goes into, so a prince can stop it and make no one die. A judge can't, he says. A judge has to just supervise and make sure it happens correctly. The prince can demand that it stop and can demand that both parties sort of reconcile, and his word is law. But by and large, for lethal duels, which I think were always less common, based on the scant sources I have so far, they seem to be less common, then yeah, like at that point it's too late. And he even goes so far as to say that if both fighters try to back out of it on the field and try to reconcile, he's not sure that should be allowed. like he makes the argument that maybe it could be allowed, but probably the fight has to continue. So yeah, and that's sort of the worst case scenario. The surprising thing to me is how much of this dueling was not the lethal kind of duel. Like, just how many different versions of people fighting for glory instead of to kill each other actually come up, both here and in some of the chronicles I've looked at. Yes?
So that actually follows that. That's not much kind of that I talk about this is like urban civil prejudice or like something was appointed by a prince. Like, can a prince need, does he think that a prince needs to bodily be present to stop it, or should he appoint a prince that is our judge?
So it seems like the prince is typically present, and the judge would be a civil judge if a prince is overseeing it. Commanders in the field can also host duels, and in that case the commander is both the prince and the judge. So where this comes into city law is when originally it comes from soldiers would come home from battle and they were no longer part of a unit where they could be handled by martial law, but if they still had disputes they needed to settle or outstanding challenges, then a prince would act as the commander to host the duel. And then from there the prince sort of becomes the centerpiece of it and commanders take a back seat over time. But in a military context, the commander is judging it and hosting it. But in a civil context, it's a civil judge from a city and a prince who authorizes the judge to go forward.
You
Yeah.
said that the challenge has to find a prince to host it.
Yeah.
So it's up to the challenged party can say, oh, I didn't find a prince, and therefore we go to the woods.
Yeah, and that's what they were doing. And what he says is that that's wrong, and they need to keep looking for a prince. Or if the challenger party gives up, then the challenger can go find a prince. And then if neither person can find a prince, which I think means if your sort of contract of weapon choice and context is just so screwed up that nobody wants anything to do with it, then you're obligated to reconcile without dueling. Because if there's no prince present, then it's not legitimate. So you better kiss and make up. But the challenger can still try to press it if the defendant wants to give up and he wants to keep going. Yes, in the back.
What was the role of the church authorities in all of this?
That's an interesting thing. The church had no explicit role because the church had decided that dueling was not legitimate. But because there were so many different legal concerns involved, the church's word was not the last word here. So the priests were forbidden from participating, like giving mass and so on to the people who were going to die, by papal bull. Although local priests were free to disregard that, because that's how the Catholic Church worked in the Middle Ages, was very little central control. So the Pope's opinion was totally banned. Your local parish priest might have a different perspective and still get involved. But clergy were forbidden from dueling as well. And we know that didn't always work out either. So the church's official position and their actual real world action didn't always line up perfectly throughout this period. And we don't see that change until centuries later, as everything gets more centralized. Yes?
So does Pozzo speak about the weapon type much? Let's say two people don't want to fight to the death, swords can be tough to pull back, so maybe let's just use quarterstaffs, for example.
He does talk occasionally about using blunt weapons,
Ah.
but he doesn't tell you very much about the implications of that. Like, there's no section on when to use blunt weapons and when not to. He'll just say that in this case they were going to fight with blunt weapons, and then he moves on. So this was one of those things that he just sort of understood and expected you to understand, it appears. But there are definitely mentions of, also, sharp lances don't break the way that jousting lances do. So if your goal is to break a bunch of lances, odds are you're not actually stabbing the guy with a sharp spearhead, right? That's just how it works. So there's certainly evidence that they were not always using these killing tools unless it was a killing duel. But he doesn't go into details about any kind of specifics there. Other questions? Actually, what time do we have, Kendra?
We have 4:40. You should tell the paper arm story.
Okay, we have 20 minutes left. Kendra reminds me of one of my favorite parts of this whole book, of the actual duels that happen. The most corner of corner cases. Two people, so I believe these were not knights, because usually when he has knights when he means knights. Because two people agree to fight on foot, in armor, with poleaxes, to the death. So they get there, the day arrives, they both get out there. One guy charges in with his poleaxe, strikes his opponent on the helmet, bashes it in, causes his face to bleed, and the prince throws the scepter in to stop the duel. So that's enough, that's enough. That guy got his head smashed, we're done. And at that point, the judge notices and discovers that the guy who had rushed in was wearing paper armor. So apparently, he had gotten like his Halloween costume armor out. He clarifies it was an entire suit of parchment that had been carefully painted to look like armor. Because he had thought that because his opponent had heavy armor, if he were wearing light armor, he could move much faster, and thereby win the duel. And this is a case, again, Pozzo has very clear ideas about unarmored fighting, but he says, this guy showed so much valor and martial spirit by rushing in with no protection and attacking his opponent such that he bashed in his helmet, that he should be given the victory, because he's clearly has more valor than the other guy does, who's wearing all that armor. So another case of, yeah, there's a rule, but there's always an exception to the rule, apparently. Likewise, there was a story of a guy who had brought fire bombs, like small projectiles, that he was throwing on the ground, causing fire to flare up and startle the other guy's horse. So the other guy couldn't charge him. Like when the horse would run in, he'd throw fire in front of it. And Puzzo was actually okay with that too, despite being not okay with the blindness powder. Throwing fire on the ground, that's legitimate. So a lot of the really weird dueling incidents that seem to come up, he doesn't play hardball nearly as much as when he's establishing ground rules about what is and is not good practice. You know, sometimes the not good practice he's still willing to allow. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, for all of these cases where the other person is doing something a little off-beat, does it matter to him whether the person doing the thing is the challenger, where it's a little kind of slimy?
Very often he doesn't.
Where it's like you should be able to defend yourself.
He usually doesn't specify. And these are just cases where, so Jess Finley pointed out to me something at WMAW that she had found by looking at other kinds of literature, which totally lines up here, is there's an idea that medieval people had of just this sort of culture of respecting audacity and respecting sort of cleverness and the ability to outwit your opponent that goes beyond morality and beyond sort of any kind of norms. There are just so many stories, especially like folk tales, where the whole point of it is one person, through lying and cheating, manages to completely outsmart their opponent, and that's always the hero of the story. So they had very much a cultural idea that that was the most commendable thing you could do, was, even if you had to break a few rules, totally outsmart and outmaneuver your opponent in a way that they can't respond to. And that's very present here, even though we're pretty post-medieval at this point. But that cultural idea of, at some point, cleverness has to be acknowledged and allowed, is still very much present in Puzzo's writing. And with that, I think we're going to end here. If you want to take a look at this text, it does not exist in English yet. I've been working on a translation for a while, and if I finish it, I'll publish it. But there are texts in Latin, Italian, and Spanish. So any of you with language skills who want to take a look, I can direct you to resources. There's also an English manuscript that we're working on getting transcribed, which is hard to read, but it's still kind of like English, from 1580. And that'll be made available when it's ready as well. And with that, I'll dismiss you guys to go look at the tournaments.